they discovered that their loyalty went with it. And finally, even some of the major species began to quietly withdraw. Not because they agreed with humanity, but because they could see which way the wind was blowing, and they wanted to be on the right side of whatever came next. Observer Laius watched all of this from Earth, where she had been living for 6 months as the Shale Collective's ambassador to humanity, and she had spent those 6 months trying to understand a species that had won a war and then used its victory to dismantle the very concept of galactic empire. She had lived among humans in their cities and their towns and their homes, and she had eaten their food and listened to their music and watched their children play in parks, and she had read their history, which was a long and bloody catalogue of exactly the kind of conquest and subjugation that the Concord practiced. And this confused her, because the humans she met did not seem like conquerors at all. And then one day she understood, and the understanding came not from a book or a briefing or a diplomatic meeting, but from a conversation with a young human woman who worked in a bakery in Geneva and who had lost her brother in the battle. Laius had asked the woman if she was angry at the Concord for starting the war, and the woman had thought about it for a moment and then said that she was not angry at the Concord, but at the system that made the war inevitable. Because any system that concentrated power in the hands of a few and denied freedom to the many would eventually produce exactly this kind of conflict. And the only way to prevent the next war was not to win this one harder, but to change the system entirely. Laius went back to her quarters that night and wrote a report to the Shale Collective that contained the single most important insight any alien species had ever produced about humanity. Humans do not think in terms of hierarchies, she wrote. They think in terms of systems, and when they encounter a system that produces suffering, they do not try to climb to the top of it, but rather try to replace it with something better. And this is why they shared the sheer drive freely. Not because they are naive or weak, but because they understood that the Rift Gate monopoly was the root cause of galactic inequality, and that destroying the monopoly was more valuable than any military victory. She paused and then added one more line. They did not want to sit atop the Concord. They wanted to make the Concord unnecessary. 1 month after the sheer drive was released, High Arbiter Zelenthos requested a private meeting with Captain Vasquez. He traveled to Earth alone, without guards or aides or ceremony, and he looked diminished in a way that had nothing to do with his physical body, which was still tall and imposing, but with something behind his 6 dark eyes that had gone quiet. Vasquez met him in a small conference room in Geneva, and they sat across from each other at a plain wooden table, and Zelenthos folded his thin limbs in front of him, and looked at the human woman who had stood in his chamber 6 months ago, and told him that his model was missing a variable. I have governed the Concord for 112 years, he said, and in that time I have overseen the resolution of 430 conflicts and the integration of 61 new species into our systems, and I have always believed that the Concord was the best possible structure for managing a galaxy of diverse and often hostile civilizations. He paused, and his mandibles clicked softly. I was wrong, and I am here to ask you the same question that my war prediction engine could not answer. What was the variable we missed? Vasquez leaned forward and rested her arms on the table, and looked at the ancient alien with eyes that held no triumph and no gloating, but something closer to compassion. You predicted what our ships could do, she said. You modeled our fleet strength and our industrial capacity and our population and our technology, and your predictions about all of those things were actually quite accurate. She shook her head slowly. But you never predicted what we would choose to do, because every model you have assumes rational actors optimizing for power. And that is a reasonable assumption, because every species you have ever encountered has behaved exactly that way. But we were not optimizing for power. Then what were you optimizing for? Zelenthos asked. Freedom, Vasquez said. Ours and everyone else's. Zelenthos was silent for a long time, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. Your species is either the salvation of this galaxy or the end of it. Vasquez smiled, and it was a real smile, warm and complicated, and full of the particular human quality that Lias had spent 6 months trying to name, and had finally decided to call stubborn hope. Why not both? Vasquez said. Weeks later, 12 species formally requested alliance with Earth, not as subjects, or tributaries or junior partners, but as equals, and they met on a station that orbited halfway between Earth and the nearest former Concord outpost. An observer Lias stood beside Captain Vasquez as the document was signed. They called it the Free Systems Accord, and its founding charter contained a single principle that no galactic government had ever enshrined before: that no species shall be required to depend on any other species for the fundamental ability to travel, to trade, or to exist as a free and sovereign civilization. It was not a perfect document, and it would not create a perfect galaxy, and every species that signed it knew that the future would contain its own conflicts and failures and disappointments. But it was a beginning, and it was built on something that the Concord had never possessed, which was the radical and terrifying idea that power shared is not power lost. Power multiplied. On the day the Accord was signed, the Concord's war prediction engine was formally decommissioned. Its engineers powered it down for the last time, in a quiet ceremony attended by only a handful of technicians. And as the vast machine went dark, its final log entry was recorded automatically by its own diagnostic systems. A message that captured in a few simple words the reason that 3,000 years of perfect predictions had failed against a species from an unremarkable yellow star. The entry read, "Model insufficient, new variable detected, human unpredictability, no correction possible." The technicians read it and looked at each other, and one of them, a young shale whose luminous body flickered with the bright gold of amusement, saved the log entry and sent a copy to observer Lias on Earth. Lias read it that evening while sitting in the bakery in Geneva, where she had become a regular customer, and she showed it to the woman behind the counter. And the woman read it and laughed, and Lias laughed too, and it was the first time she had ever laughed at a human joke, and understood why it was funny. Outside the bakery window, the sun was setting over the old city, and the sky was the color of fire and gold. And somewhere far above it, past the atmosphere, and past the moon, and past the edges of the solar system, the galaxy was changing. And it was changing because a small and stubborn species on a small and stubborn world had looked at the way things were and decided that they could be better. The Kalosi Vanguard dropped out of faster-than-light travel in the Proxima Centauri system at exactly 1400 hours Galactic Standard Time, and 2,000 warships materialized in perfect formation like a fist closing around an empty room. Commander Kethrall stood on the bridge of the lead dreadnought and looked at the tactical display and saw nothing. No defense platforms, no minefields, no orbital stations, no ships of any kind, just the dim red light of the Proxima star, and the quiet spinning of a few rocky planets that held small human colonies on their surfaces. "Sensors report the system is clear," his tactical officer announced. "No enemy vessels detected within scanning range." Kethrall flexed his clawed hands and felt a wave of contempt wash through him, because this was not a battle, but an errand, and he was a warrior of the Kalosi Dominion, and he deserved better enemies than a species that could not even be bothered to show up for its own. "Signal the fleet to advance to planetary orbit," he ordered. "Begin bombardment targeting on the primary colony." "Yes, Commander." The 2,000 ships began to move forward in formation, their engines burning bright against the darkness, and they covered 10,000 kilometers in silence, and then 20,000, and then 50,000. And the system remained empty and quiet, and Kethrall began composing his victory report in his head. He never finished it. At 72,000 kilometers from the colony world, space itself came apart. There was no warning, no energy signature, no alarm from any sensor on any ship, because the sheer minds did not exist in the same reality as the sensors that were trying to detect them. And when they activated, the only indication was a sudden wrongness in the fabric of the universe, a tearing that started as a point and expanded into a wound that swallowed everything it touched. Caught a Kalosi heavy cruiser directly amidships, and the ship did not explode or break apart or burn, but simply ceased to exist in one piece, as the dimensional rupture opened inside it and pulled half the vessel into subspace, while leaving the other half tumbling through normal space, venting atmosphere and bodies and fire. Then the second mine detonated, and the third, and the fourth, and within 3 seconds, the leading edge of the Kalosi vanguard was engulfed in a cascade of spatial tears that ripped through the formation like invisible teeth. Kethril watched his tactical display turn red, and then turn black, as ships disappeared from it faster than the computer could update, and he heard screaming on the fleet communication channel. Not words, but the raw animal sound of beings who were dying in a way they could not comprehend. 800 ships were destroyed in 90 seconds. Not damaged, not disabled, destroyed, reduced to clouds of metal and frozen atmosphere and things that had once been living beings. And the remaining 1,200 ships of the vanguard scattered in every direction like prey animals, fleeing a predator they could not see. "What is happening?" Kethril shouted at his tactical officer, and the tactical officer stared at his instruments with wide eyes and said nothing, because his instruments were telling him that space itself was attacking them, and he had no protocol for that. 12,000 kilometers behind the chaos, aboard the flagship Unyielding Fang, Ambassador Drethvon stood on his command bridge and watched his vanguard die. The tactical display showed the vanguard as a formation of green dots, and then it showed them as a scattering of yellow dots, and then it showed them as a shrinking number of red dots, and then there were very few dots at all. And the whole thing happened so fast that Drethvon's aide had not even finished pouring his ceremonial pre-battle drink. "Fleet Command," Drethvon said, and his voice was steady but his eyes were wide. "All ships halt advance immediately. Do not enter the engagement zone. I repeat, do not enter." But the Concorde Armada was enormous and spread across multiple systems, and the orders traveled at the speed of communication, which was fast, but not fast enough. In the Tau Ceti system, a battle group of 1,500 ships from 3 different species hit a second sheer minefield and lost 600 vessels in under 2 minutes. In the Epsilon Eridani system, a Kalosi siege fleet emerged from FTL directly into a cluster of mines, so dense that the dimensional tears overlapped each other, and 700 ships were destroyed instantaneously in a ripple of folding space that looked from a distance like a flower blooming and closing in the same heartbeat. And then the Ghost Fleet arrived. 214 human warships materialized from their dimensional pockets, not in front of the Concorde fleet, and not behind it, but inside it, between the capital ships, underneath the escorts, so close to the enemy that several human vessels emerged within weapons range of a dozen targets simultaneously. The Concorde's ships were built for a specific kind of war, the kind where fleets faced each other across thousands of kilometers and traded fire in long, elegant exchanges that could last for hours. And their shields were designed to deflect attacks coming from outside, and their weapons were optimized for long-range precision. And their tactical doctrine assumed that the enemy would be over there, at a distance, behaving in a predictable and rational manner. The humans were not over there. They were right here. The blink cannons fired, and tungsten rods the size of a human arm accelerated to near light speed, and then passed through micro-shear points that skipped them past the intervening space and delivered them directly inside enemy hulls, bypassing shields entirely, because the projectiles never technically passed through the shields at all. Reactors breached and ships detonated, and the Concorde formation, which had looked so impressive and so overwhelming, dissolved into chaos. as explosions chained from vessel to vessel, and debris fields collided, and navigation systems failed, and communications jammed under the weight of 10,000 distress calls happening simultaneously. On the Concord observation station, far from the battle, High Arbiter Zelenthos stood before the War Prediction Engine's display and watched the real-time feed with all 6 of his eyes open as wide as they could go. The prediction model was updating itself continuously, recalculating the expected outcome as new data poured in, and the numbers were changing so fast that the display flickered. 6.4 hours had been the original estimate for human defeat. The engine revised it to 4.1 hours, then to 2 hours. Then to 47 minutes, but the direction had reversed, and now it was 47 minutes until Concord defeat. And then the engine did something it had never done in 3,000 years of continuous operation. It stopped. The display showed a single word that Zelenthos had never seen it produce before, a word that meant the model had encountered a situation so far outside its parameters that it could no longer make any prediction at all. Error. Zelenthos stared at it, and the delegates around him stared at it, and for the first time in living memory, the Grand Deliberation Chamber was completely silent. "What are they?" Zelenthos whispered, and no one answered. Back in the Proxima Centauri system, at the epicenter of the devastation, a single human stealth corvette materialized from a dimensional pocket exactly 200 meters from the bridge windows of Unyielding Fang. It was a tiny ship, barely larger than one of the flagship's shuttle bays, and it hung there in space like a dark splinter against the backdrop of burning wreckage. And it did not fire. Instead, it transmitted a message on an open channel. And the message was from Admiral James Okafor, and it was addressed directly to Ambassador Drethvon, and every surviving ship in the Concord Armada heard it. "Ambassador, this is Admiral Okafor of United Earth Defense. Your fleet has suffered significant losses, and will continue to do so for as long as it remains in human space. You have 14 minutes to signal a full and unconditional retreat of all Concord forces from our territory. After that, we stop being generous." Drethvon stood on his bridge and looked at the tiny ship floating just outside his windows, close enough that he could see the dark hull plating and the faint glow of its engines. And he understood something that cut through his pride and his rage and his 6,000 years of Kylosi military tradition. The humans had placed that ship 200 meters from his bridge to make a point. They could have placed a bomb there instead. They could have killed him at any moment from the very beginning, and they had chosen not to. And the restraint was not mercy, but a message. And the message was that the humans were in complete control of this situation, and had been from the first second. Drethvon looked at the burning remnants of his fleet, and then he looked at the tiny human ship, and then he looked at the chronometer, and watched the 14 minutes begin to count down. The greatest military force the galaxy had ever assembled was dying around him, and the species that was killing it had not even committed its full strength. He had 13 minutes and 42 seconds to decide. Drethvon signaled the retreat at minute 44. He did not wait for the full 14 minutes that Okafor had offered him, because there was nothing left to wait for, and every second that passed meant more of his ships turning into fire and wreckage and silence. Even his pride had limits when measured against the complete annihilation of everything he commanded. The order went out on all channels, unencrypted, in every language the Concord used, and it was the simplest order Drethvon had ever given, and the hardest word he had ever spoken: retreat. Across human space, in 14 star systems simultaneously, the surviving Concord vessels began to turn and run. The human forces let them go, and the shear mines went dormant, and the Ghost Fleet held position without firing, and the blink cannons powered down. There was a silence that spread across light years like a hell breath. The Kalosi Dominion, conquerors of 400 star systems, now watched the retreat, knowing their time of conquest had ended. Systems, masters of the most powerful conventional military the galaxy had ever produced, had retreated for the first time in their recorded history. The final numbers arrived on Admiral Okafor's display in the vault beneath the Swiss Alps at minute 51, and he read them with a face that showed nothing. Of the 11,800 Concorde ships that had entered human space, 7,412 had been destroyed or disabled beyond recovery, and the rest had fled, carrying damage that would take months or years to repair. And the combined casualties across 9 species numbered in the millions. Human losses were 31 ships and 4,218 personnel. The engagement had lasted 43 minutes from the first shear mine detonation to the retreat signal. Okafor stared at those numbers for a long time, and then he turned away from the display and walked to his private office and closed the door and sat down at his desk and put his face in his hands. He stayed like that for several minutes, and no one disturbed him, because the people who worked with him understood that James Okafor had just done something that he considered necessary and unforgivable at the same time, and he needed a moment to carry both of those truths. He had killed millions of beings to protect 8 billion, and the math was simple and the logic was sound, and he would do it again without hesitation, and none of that made it weigh any less. When he came out of his office, his face was composed, and his voice was steady, and he ordered the fleet to stand down from combat status and begin search and rescue operations for surviving Concorde crew members adrift in the battle zones, because the war was over, and the people floating in the wreckage were no longer enemies, but beings who needed help. 342,000 Concorde survivors were pulled from the debris over the following 6 hours, and they were given medical treatment and food and quarters, and many of them could not understand why, because in their experience, the victor of a war did not rescue the defeated, but subjugated them. 8,000 light-years away, the Galactic Concorde was breaking apart. The Grand Deliberation Chamber had erupted into chaos the moment the retreat was confirmed, and species that had voted unanimously for war 12 hours earlier were now screaming at each other across the vast room, and alliances that had held for centuries shattered in minutes as every delegate tried to distance themselves from the disaster. High Arbiter Zelento stood on his floating platform and watched his life's work collapse around him, and his insectoid face was unreadable, but his limbs trembled with a fine vibration that his species only exhibited under extreme stress. The war prediction engine remained in its error state, and its engineers had been unable to restart it, because the engine was not malfunctioning, but rather had encountered a fundamental limitation in its own design. And the limitation was this: it could only predict the behavior of species that fought wars the way wars had always been fought, and humanity did not. The political consequences cascaded through the chamber like falling dominoes. The 3 species that had voted against the war demanded an immediate investigation into who had authorized the engagement and why the prediction engine had not been independently verified. 12 minor species that had long chafed under Concorde trade restrictions and military oversight saw an opportunity in the chaos and began making quiet overtures to each other about forming an independent bloc. The Kalosi delegation sat in stunned silence, and Drethvan's empty chair was a symbol that every delegate understood, because the greatest warrior in the galaxy had been beaten so thoroughly that he had not even bothered to come back and explain himself. And in the middle of all of this, Observer Lias of the Shale Collective requested and received permission to travel to Earth as a diplomatic envoy, because the Shale were among the 3 species that had voted against the war, and they understood, perhaps better than anyone else, that understanding humanity was now the single most important question facing every living being in the galaxy. Her request was granted immediately, because no one else wanted to go. Captain Elena Vasquez arrived back on Earth 2 days after the battle, and she found the planet in a state that surprised her, because it was not celebrating. There were no victory parades, no public festivals, no triumphant broadcasts, and the news networks covered the battle with a tone that was closer to relief than joy. And the faces of the people she passed on her way from the landing field to the vault were not the faces of conquerors, but of survivors who understood how close they had come to extinction. She found Okafor in the memorial garden that had been hastily constructed in one of the vault's upper levels. A small room with 4,218 names inscribed on the walls, one for every human who had died in the 43 minutes that saved their species. He was standing in front of the wall reading the names, and she stood beside him and said nothing for a while. "The Concord is falling apart," she finally said. "Salenthos is facing calls for his resignation. The Kalosi are humiliated, and at least a dozen species are already reaching out to us through back channels." "I know," Okafor said. "So what happens now?" He turned away from the wall and looked at her with eyes that were very tired. "Now comes the part that matters," he said. "The battle was the easy part, Elena. Any fool with enough firepower can win a battle. And what we did was not special because we are stronger than them, but because we were willing to spend 11 years preparing a trap so thorough that the war lasted less than an hour." He paused. "But a species that wins through fear alone is just another Kalosi. And I did not spend 11 years building Prometheus so that we could become the thing we were trying to protect ourselves from." Vasquez studied him carefully. "You have a plan?" "I have always had a plan, and the battle was only the first step, and the next step is going to make the Concord angrier than the battle did, because we are not going to conquer them or subjugate them or demand tribute or any of the things they expect." "And what are we going to do?" Okafor looked at her, and for the first time in days, something that was almost a smile crossed his face. "We are going to set them free." Vasquez did not understand what he meant, and she said so, and Okafor told her that he would explain everything when the time was right, but that first they had a guest arriving. "Observer Laius of the Shale Collective is on her way to Earth," he said. "She was one of 3 votes against the war, and Elena, I need you to meet her personally when she arrives, because she is going to be the most important ally humanity has ever had, and she does not know it yet." 1 week later, Laius's small silver ship descended through Earth's atmosphere and landed at a facility in Switzerland, and Captain Vasquez was waiting for her at the bottom of the ramp. Laius stepped onto human soil for the first time, and her luminous body flickered with the pale blue of curiosity and the deep amber of caution, and she looked at the human woman standing before her and asked the question that every being in the galaxy wanted answered. "You had complete military superiority after the battle. Your fleet was intact, our defenses were shattered, and you could have pushed through to our homeworlds and conquered everything between here and the galactic core. Did you stop?" Vasquez looked at the alien diplomat and answered with 4 words that Laius would spend the next 6 months trying to understand. "Because that is not the point." Admiral James Okafor had not slept in 31 hours, and he did not plan to sleep for 31 more. And this was fine with him, because he had spent 11 years preparing for the moment that was now unfolding, and he intended to be awake for every second of it. The command center beneath the Swiss Alps was called the Vault, and it was buried so deep in the mountain that the rock above it could survive a direct orbital bombardment. And inside it, 200 men and women sat at their stations in a room lit by the blue glow of holographic displays that showed every ship and satellite and weapons platform that humanity possessed. And humanity possessed far more than the Galactic Concord believed. Okafor stood at the central command table with his hands flat on its surface, and he was a tall man with dark skin and gray at his temples, and the kind of stillness that came not from peace, but from a fury so deep and so controlled that it had become indistinguishable from calm. Beside him stood Dr. Eris Tan, and she was the opposite of still, her small frame practically vibrating with nervous energy as her fingers danced across a tablet, running final diagnostics on systems that she had spent 15 years building, and that no one outside this room fully understood. "The Concorde Armada is assembling at the Arcturus staging zone," said a voice from the intelligence station. "Current count is 11,800 vessels, with more arriving every hour, and the lead elements are Kalosi dreadnoughts under the direct command of Ambassador Drethvon." Okafor nodded slowly, and he looked at the display showing the enemy fleet as a massive cloud of blue dots gathering like a storm. "How long until they move?" he asked. "Fleet intelligence estimates 18 hours for full assembly, then 6 to 8 hours of transit to our border systems." "Good," Okafor said. "That gives us time." He turned to Dr. Tan. "Of Prometheus." She looked up from her tablet and pushed her glasses higher on her nose, and her eyes had the particular brightness of someone who was equally terrified and excited. "All 3 layers are active," she said. "Shear mines are seeded across every approach vector into all 14 colony systems, and the Sol system, totaling 42,000 individual devices, and each one is invisible to every scanning technology the Concorde has ever developed, because they exist partially outside of normal spacetime." She swiped her tablet, and a new display appeared, showing a web of red lines crisscrossing human space. "Blink cannon platforms are online at every colony and in solar orbit, 68 platforms total, and each one can fire a tungsten rod at 0.97 light speed through a micro-shear point that bypasses any known shield technology, because the projectile does not travel through normal space between the cannon and the target." Again. "And the Ghost Fleet, 214 combat vessels currently sitting in dimensional pockets where they are completely undetectable, ready to materialize on your command at any coordinates you specify." Okafor studied the displays and said nothing for a long moment. To understand why these weapons existed, and why the Concorde had never imagined them, you had to understand the single most important fact about humanity's place in the galaxy. Every spacefaring species in the Concorde had achieved faster-than-light travel through the same method, the Rift Gate Network, a system of ancient jump points that had been discovered and standardized and regulated over millennia, until they became the foundation of all galactic civilization and commerce and military strategy. The Concorde controlled the gates, and controlling the gates meant controlling everything, because without them, no ship could cross interstellar distances in any reasonable time. When humanity first reached out to the stars and made contact with the Concorde, they were told they could access the gate network if they submitted to Concorde authority and paid the required tributes and accepted military oversight. And humanity had refused, not out of pride, but out of a deep and ancient instinct that told them never to depend on someone else for something as fundamental as the ability to move freely. And so humanity had been denied gate access and left isolated, and the Concorde had expected them to either comply eventually or remain trapped in their single star system forever. Instead, humanity did something that the Concorde scientists later described as impossible, and then reclassified as merely insane. They invented their own method of faster-than-light travel. Dr. Eris Tan's predecessor, a physicist named Yuki Hashimoto, had discovered that the membrane between normal space and subspace was not a wall, but a fabric, and like any fabric, it could be stretched and folded and cut, and if you cut it in just the right way, you could step through the gap and emerge somewhere else entirely. They called it the shear drive, and it was ugly and inefficient compared to the elegant simplicity of the rift gates. And a shear drive transit left a ship's crew nauseous and disoriented and occasionally caused nosebleeds. And the Concorde scientists had examined it briefly and dismissed it as a crude workaround that would never compete with gate technology. They were right that it could not compete with gate technology for transportation. What they never considered was that a technology that could cut space-time could also be used to cut other things. Okafor had understood this from the beginning, long before he became admiral, back when he was a young captain who had watched the Concorde's fleets casually annihilate a species called the Velnari for the crime of falling behind on their gate tolls. Watched 17 billion Velnari become a subject population in a single afternoon. And he had looked at the gate network and understood that it was not infrastructure, but a leash. And he had sworn that humanity would never wear one. Project Prometheus had been born in secret 11 years ago, funded through hidden channels and built in facilities that did not officially exist. And its entire purpose was to answer a single question. If the Concorde comes for us, how do we make them regret it so completely that they never come again? Admiral, the intelligence officer called out, "We are receiving a transmission from Captain Vasquez aboard the Concorde observation station, Priority Alpha." "Put her through." Vasquez's face appeared on the display, and she looked tired, but her eyes were sharp. James Drethvon is leading the fleet personally aboard his flagship, Unyielding Fang, and he has positioned it in the center rear of the formation, behind 3 layers of escort ships, because apparently even conquerors like to feel safe. Okafor almost smiled. "We have his position." "Thank you, Elena. Get yourself to the extraction point and we will have a ship waiting." "Already on my way." "And James, one more thing. Observer Lias of the Shale Collective voted against the war, and she has been asking questions about our technology that suggest she is smarter than the rest of them. So when this is over, we might want to talk to her." The transmission ended, and Okafor turned back to the command table and looked at his officers. In approximately 20 hours, 12,000 warships from 9 species are going to enter our space, expecting to fight a fleet of 300 outdated vessels, crewed by a species they consider barely sentient, he said. And his voice was quiet and even, and carried the weight of something that had been planned down to the last detail. "They are going to be disappointed," and clasped his hands behind his back. "All stations begin final preparations. Bring the shear mine network to active status. Move the Ghost Fleet to pre-assault coordinates and spin up every blink cannon we have." He paused and looked at the display one more time, at the blue storm of the Concorde Armada growing larger by the minute. "They gave us 6.4 hours, he said. "We are going to need considerably less than that." Across the command center, 200 officers began working in focused silence, and deep in the fabric of space, across 14 star systems, 42,000 invisible wounds in reality hummed quietly and waited for something to fly into them. And 8,000 light-years away, aboard a neutral observation vessel drifting near the Concorde Armada, Observer Lias sat alone in her quarters and read through old intelligence files on humanity with growing unease, because she had found something buried in a cultural analysis that no military planner had considered worth flagging. Every species in the galaxy had a concept of acceptable losses, a percentage of their own forces they were willing to sacrifice to achieve victory. And this number varied from species to species, but it always existed because war was fundamentally a calculation of cost and benefit. Humanity's military doctrine contained no such concept. Instead, they had a term that translated roughly as overwhelming first strike, and it described a philosophy that did not ask, "How much am I willing to lose?" but rather, "How do I make sure the enemy loses everything before they can fire a single shot?" Lias tried to send a warning to the fleet, but her message was flagged as non-urgent by the Concorde's communication filters, and routed to a queue that would not be reviewed for hours. The grand deliberation chamber hung in the cold silence of space like a metal flower blooming against the stars, and inside it, 415 alien species had gathered to decide the fate of a world they had never bothered to visit. High Arbiter Zelenthos stood at the center of the chamber on a raised platform that floated above the delegates like a throne made of light, and his insectoid body clicked softly as he adjusted his robes and looked out over the assembled representatives with his 6 dark eyes that had seen empires rise and crumble across 3,000 years of galactic politics. He was old, even by the standards of his species, and he had learned long ago that the galaxy was not a place for sentiment or mercy, but a machine that rewarded only those who understood power and used it without hesitation. "The matter before the Concord today," he said, his voice amplified through translation devices that turned his clicking mandibles into words every species could understand, "concerns the species known as humans, originating from the 3rd planet of an unremarkable yellow star in the outer spiral arm." A murmur rippled through the chamber, and it carried the unmistakable sound of amusement. Ambassador Drethvon of the Kalosi Dominion leaned forward in his massive chair, his scaled body shifting with the slow confidence of a predator who had never once been prey, and his teeth showed in what passed for a smile among his kind. The Kalosi had conquered 400 star systems across 6,000 years, and Drethvon himself had personally led the subjugation of 11 worlds, and he looked at the data scrolling across his display with the lazy interest of someone reading about an insect. 14 colony worlds, he said out loud, and several delegates near him laughed. 300 ships in their entire fleet, and they refused to pay gate tolls or submit to military oversight. He shook his enormous head and his golden eyes gleamed. "They are either very brave or very stupid, and in my experience, those 2 things are the same." More laughter filled the chamber, and Zelenthos let it continue for a moment before raising one thin limb for silence. "The Concord has attempted diplomatic resolution," he continued. "Ambassador Vasquez of Earth was invited to these proceedings, and has been present for the duration of our assessment, and she will be given the opportunity to speak before the vote." Every eye and sensor and optical organ in the chamber turned toward the small figure standing on the lower platform reserved for petitioning species. Captain Elena Vasquez stood there in her dark blue uniform with her hands clasped behind her back, and she looked impossibly small against the vast architecture of the chamber, surrounded by beings that towered over her in size and in the weight of their civilizations. She was not beautiful in the way that holographic dramas portrayed diplomats, and her face was hard and lined from years spent in cockpits before she traded flight controls for negotiation tables. And her dark hair was pulled back tight, and her eyes moved across the chamber with the calm focus of someone who was counting exits. But she did not look afraid, and several of the more perceptive delegates noticed this and found it curious. Zelenthos gestured to the central display, and the war prediction engine activated, filling the chamber with a holographic model of human space that glowed like a handful of scattered embers against the vast blue territory of the Concord. The war prediction engine was the pride of the Concord, an artificial intelligence that had accurately forecast the outcome of every single military engagement for 3,000 years without exception, and it had modeled fleet compositions and supply lines and tactical doctrines and psychological profiles for every known species. Been wrong. The simulation played out in accelerated time above the delegates, and they watched as the blue arrows of the Concord Expeditionary Force swept through human space like water through sand. Colony after colony fell, and the tiny red dots of human ships winked out one by one, and Earth itself was surrounded and blockaded and forced to surrender. And the whole thing was over so fast that several delegates actually looked disappointed. "Total subjugation achieved in 6.4 standard hours," Zelenthos announced. "Projected Concord casualties, 0.3% of deployed forces, which falls well within acceptable parameters." Drethvon slammed one massive fist on his armrest in approval, and the sound echoed through the chamber like a war drum. "I will lead the expedition personally," he declared. "My fleet alone outnumbers theirs 40 to 1, and I would consider it an insult to require assistance." Collective sat quietly in the upper tiers of the chamber, and her luminous body flickered with colors that her species used instead of words among themselves, And the colors right now were the deep violet of worry and the pale silver of doubt. She had spent decades studying emerging species, and something about the humans troubled her in a way she could not yet articulate. Something in the way their representatives stood so still and so calm, while an entire chamber discussed the destruction of her civilization. Zelenthos turned to Vasquez and extended one limb in a gesture of formal courtesy. "The representative of Earth may speak," she said. Vasquez stepped forward and looked up at the assembly, and her voice was steady and clear, and carried no trace of pleading or anger. "I have listened to your prediction," she said, "and I have watched your simulation with great interest, and I want to thank the Council for being so thorough in its analysis." That pause, the chamber was perfectly silent. "But your model is missing a variable." She said nothing else, and she offered no explanation, and she did not elaborate.